So yeah, I rode out the pandemic in New York. I was quite lucky, I think, compared to some people. In I'm used to working at home, and I like spending time on my own. Uh, we were also quarantined with somebody who could do childcare, which made a great difference to two novelists who otherwise would have been constantly trying to entertain two small children. But yeah, we were in New York for the whole time. Occasionally, we would get invited to go away for a weekend by richer friends who had holed up somewhere upstate. And so some of the really strange experience of going from this city, which was in the grip, certainly in early 2020, was in the grip of the pandemic in a way that felt very scary and very intense, going to some sort of pastoral idyll was a real it was like entering a different world, and that experience really stuck with me and became, I think, the sort of seed of Blue Ruin.
And this is the third in a trilogy, right?
It's a very loose trilogy. You could read them in any order, and there's no actual narrative continuity between the three books. But there's certainly a constellation, if not an official trilogy, in that each of them is concerned with one of the arts. I mean, there's a book about music, which is White Tears. There's a book about a writer, Red Pill, and this is a book about visual artists. And it's also with the kind of colors thing, which, to be frank, wasn't my intention when I started the first book, but somehow emerged from the project. They are trying to do something that I've heard people grumble that the contemporary novel doesn't do, which is to really address the world now in a straightforward, kind of full-throated way. And I've tried to, certainly with Blue Ruin, to provide a kind of record of how we, let's say that kind of modified we, were all feeling in the early days of the pandemic, because it's got a very strange quality, the way we think about the pandemic now, in that each thing that we found out and each kind of revision of our understanding of the world kind of wiped out the previous one. So it's quite hard to get back to what we all believed about the pandemic in the very early days. Now, I kept a diary, and I was looking back at it and what I thought was going on. I remember, we were bleaching packages and weren't sure whether touching things or kind of whether kind of being outdoors at some kind of long range from another human being might still be dangerous. I remember taking a walk in a very isolated place and then coming across somebody else, and the two of us just fumbling for our masks as if we were about to infect each other fatally. Whereas, a year later, as it was still going on, we got much more kind of calibrated about our responses.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm like a hiker. I live in Los Angeles. I go hiking all the time. There was a period of months where I hiked with a mask on.
For sure. I rode my bike around the empty city, like with no one in sight, with a mask on.
Kind of feel silly now looking back. I guess I probably didn't need to.
It does, but at the same time, I think people use that feeling of silliness to dismiss a lot of the precautions that we took, and to say that we were duped in some way into kind of becoming too timid. But we really didn't know. That's the thing. We've gone from a state of almost anything could be possible to understanding fairly well the contours of the disease. And I think, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book in the way that I did was just to try and document the strange social rules that it imposed on us. The way it felt if, for example, that you met somebody else whose sense of risk was very different in one direction or another to your own. And, one person sort of dressed in a chem bio warfare suit, and the other person, being like, take your mask off. And social distance, touching people, breathing the same air, all these things that we'd taken for granted before suddenly became at least things we had to think about. And so while the novel's not really about the pandemic in the sense that it's not trying to kind of litigate what was right and wrong about the public health response or like, whether it was a lab leak or anything like that. But it's about the sort of social experience of riding through the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, it was a very fluid situation. That's the thing. Like, just listening to you talk, I'm like, yeah, we really didn't know. And I think that fluidity was evident to me as it was happening. It was obvious. Like, we were trying to learn. Scientists, doctors, the medical community was trying to learn in real time how the virus behaved, how it was transmitted. And your book, like you say, it's not exactly about the pandemic in this manner of like litigating it, but it is the backdrop. And we do see in the characters in the book different ways of responding to the pandemic. I'm thinking of is it the Marshall character? Is that his name?
Yeah, I mean, he's somebody who he's an art dealer, and he spends a lot of time on the internet and has really fallen into a kind of paranoid state where he thinks that what's happening is the slippery slope into total social breakdown. And so he's stockpiling canned food and he's into guns, and he has this worldview which is, he's more or less already living in The Walking Dead or something like that. He's preparing for the zombie apocalypse, and the kind of the way he reacts to the other small group of people who are all holed up in this place upstate is to berate them for not understanding the world as he does, and because that's another. I mean, it's not just the pandemic, but it's a feature of our social world these days, is this extraordinary sense of my reality is not the same as your reality. The kind of silo effect has now got so intense that we almost feel that there are people who are in a kind of unbridgeable different world to us, and we've kind of given up attempting to kind of make commensurate the realities that come from our media consumption and our sort of sense of things more generally.
I mean, the pandemic and just that period in, American history in particular, because 2020 not only saw this pandemic sweep over the world, but it also saw our election, maybe the most harrowing election in modern history. I would have to say it's probably
I think
the
that's
case.
Right.
And so it really became a kind of crucible, or a kind of, what's the right word? It was a way
Petri dish.
A petri dish. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you really found out about people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, certain people, like you say, responded to the pandemic by going down internet rabbit holes and buying guns and being paranoid, and other people just were like, no, it's not happening, and take your mask off, and this is all a conspiracy on the part of the CDC. And then other people got really vigilant and were scolding people for not masking up and protecting elders. And we can all kind of pick our approach, but it became a way of really seeing people.
Yeah, I mean, I had another thing going. As you mentioned, the election, the run up to the election was extremely intense, and the protests here in New York were very intense. So there was a period of time, which is pretty much the period of time that I've chosen to set the novel in, where here in Brooklyn, every night there were continual fireworks. It had this kind of war zone quality, just because there was a sort of, the normal 4th of July, shoot fireworks at each other thing that some kind of kids do, somehow lasted, I don't know, a month and a half every night.
Same here. Same in Los Angeles.
And I mean, I heard people were running kind of big kind of trunk loads of fireworks up from Georgia or somewhere where they were easier to buy in bulk. But so that was going on. The protests were going on. I mean, people were throwing Molotovs at my local police station, and the NYPD were responding by flying helicopters in a sort of stationary pattern over most of the part of Brooklyn that I live in. So, there were times when the sound of rotors directly above I'm speaking to you from my office, and it's upstairs, and there, it was a deafening sound of helicopter rotors just for hour after hour at night. And the sort of feeling of being under siege was really intense. And, as I said, like, occasionally I'd get out of the city and it would be bizarre to be in, out in the woods and, in a place that felt so peaceful. And that opposition was really kind of foundational to my thinking. And the choice I made in the book is to put almost everything that happens in the city off stage, so that, I don't know, the real world is kind of pushing at the edges of this little bubble that these people are in, but very rarely do you actually get a sense of what's going on out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something dreamlike about this book and the world that these people have kind of cultivated upstate. But I think the same could be said for my personal experience, just this domestic life that was pretty hermetic, the way that all of us had to be, like whether you're in your apartment in Brooklyn or you're in LA, like I look back on that time and the fluidity of it and the surreality of it. And it is kind of dreamlike, right?
It is dream. I mean, I'm glad you used the word, because one of the sort of secret models for the book is Midsummer Night's Dream, where the people leave the city, the real world of the city, and they go to the enchanted forest, and all this kind of fantastical fairy related stuff happens to them there. So I wanted, to kind of play with that really deep and traditional kind of archetypal opposition between a sort of place of enchantment that's outside the world, and then the real being somewhere else.
See, I'm very glad I stumbled into that, because as I was reading this novel, like preparing for the interview, I was thinking to myself, like, Hari is he's a very smart writer, and there's a lot of stuff going on subsurface that I'm probably missing. So you can imagine me, the relief I feel, like, oh yeah, of course, I knew that, Midsummer Night's Dream. But it's a book that I think has a lot on its mind. Your work has an intelligence to it. And I feel like you are, I think, as you mentioned earlier, examining the way life is lived now through your novels, in particular, the Red, White, and Blue cycle. And at the same time, this particular novel, Blue Ruin, could fairly be described as high concept, at least in terms of the initial setup. And what I mean by that is we have a character named Jay, who is an artist who has essentially vanished from his previous life as an artist for a period of 20 years. And at the book's outset, he shows up at a compound, a wealthy kind of compound upstate in New York as a grocery delivery man. And he is suffering from what seems like long COVID. And he arrives to deliver groceries and is received by, of all people, his ex-girlfriend. That's, speaking of the magic of the enchanted forest. Like, it's a very high concept thing in a very literary work, by what I would consider a very literary novel. Can you talk about that choice?
Absolutely. I mean, I think once I had sat with the idea that that's what I was doing, that I was basing the novel on this incredibly unlikely coincidence, I realized that it was a particular kind of a story. And so for me, the word I use about it is a romance, with the kind of capital R, in that I wanted to write the story that would have a kind of archetypal quality to it, that would be, once this initial coincidence, this initial kind of unlikely meeting had happened, there would be a resolution that would feel like a kind of narrative that you could have maybe even found in the 17th or 18th century or something like that. It's all taking place on the one country estate, and there are pairs of lovers, and all this sort of thing is going on. But onto that, I'm still the kind of writer I am, and so I wanted to layer stories that had to do with things like class, because I mean, one of the things that the pandemic really showed us is the brutality of the class divisions. There were some people who had experiences like us where we could, sounds like you had a similar vibe to me, that it's mostly indoors, mostly with your family. But there are other people who are kind of still having to go out and deliver food, and to be essential workers, and to, who weren't able to keep themselves isolated and safe in exactly the same way, even in the early days of the pandemic, when we had no sense about what level of risk they were taking. and then there are the sort of the super people, the kind of the people who seem to blip out of existence and kind of reappear on in a bunker in New Zealand. And I'll never forget, I think it was David Geffen. He posted a drone picture of his massive yacht, and a little caption about social distancing in the Caribbean. And it was like the entire Western Hemisphere just wanted to say F you to that guy. I mean,
it was one of the most tone deaf billionaire moments of all time. I mean, just truly, truly gross.
It was extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I have a file of those kind of things. I mean, I was grabbing, anything that I could find that seemed to typify a particular kind of moment in the pandemic. The various kind of paranoid rantings and the people, as you say, the people who were castigating each other, the people who were, everybody became more themselves or became kind of, exposed there. Because so much of our personalities are about our relationship to risk, and I'm fascinated by that. And this was a kind of massive, unknown. What are you going to do about that? And everybody showed who they were, and people panicked, people became angry, people kind of became full of love, people became full of kind of social, desire for community, all these things. And it went on, and it was like it's like a Rorschach blot for the
I was thinking litmus. I was thinking litmus test. That's what the word I was looking for earlier. Because the people in your life, including your family, because there's variance even within a family in terms of response. However, people responded to life from March of 2020 until say Inauguration Day 2021. It's probably close to the truth, right? I mean, it's it was a real litmus.
And the other thing is that then we decided almost as a culture to memory hole the whole thing. It's been hard to even kind of mentally kind of bring yourself to go back into it. But in terms of we go through such a sort of a strange process these days when a lot of people behave as if it never happened at all, partly because I think there's a kind of embarrassment about it, in that everybody freaked out. Every single person, from the world leaders down to the lowest of the low, everybody lost their minds and did show themselves, and there is something about that feels embarrassing. And I think also we're so desperate to kind of have a future and to get beyond it that also we didn't want to dwell in it. We certainly didn't want to do any kind of post-mortem, if this happens again, how could we do better? We just decided to sort of barrel forward and go back to the club and
learn from our mistakes. Are you crazy?
No,
never.
No,
it's not improve. Pump the brakes on improving as a society. But it was an interesting time, and I want to talk in greater depth about the characters in this novel and the world that they inhabit, not just upstate at this compound, which is where the bulk of the sort of present day action takes place, but in particular the art world, because this is very much a novel that is about art, the making of art, the commodification of art, the commodification of the artist, which is another thing, another aspect to it that I guess it's always been around. Seems maybe like it's increasingly important in the digital age. You know what I'm saying? There was a time, it seems like there was a time when the writer, for example, could just sort of live in his or her garret and crank out novels. And now you've got to be out there presenting yourself and talking to the camera in TikTok videos and stuff. So it's maybe a less dignified world, than it once was in that way. But let's just talk a little bit so that listeners who have not yet had a chance to read can understand the sort of backstory among Jay and Alice and Rob in particular.
So they are people who met each other either at art school or just after art school in London in the very late 90s. And so there's a period of time when they were friends, that Jay and Alice were dating, and they were running around in this East London art scene, which at the time was an incredibly exciting place to be. I mean, no surprise, I've drawn on, things that happened to me in my 20s. I was in that world and part of that scene, and it was just after this group of artists who became known as the Young British Artists, or YBAs, had become a kind of huge deal. People like Damien Hirst with his Pickled Shark in a Tank, and Tracy Emin and another number of those people, they become huge art stars. And in their wake, the kind of milieu that they came out of, which was this kind of East End, kind of quite down a heel world in some ways, became very fascinating. It was also a kind of, there was a moment between let's say 1997, with the end of the Conservative government that had ruled Britain since I was a small child. Basically, they'd been in since 1979. Suddenly there was a Labour government, and this sort of young-looking Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who appeared to be, much closer in tone than the sort of waxworks who'd been in charge of things for a while. It was the period where people talked about cool Britannia, and there was, and it was pre 9/11. So there's this kind of period that's actually very short in retrospect, 4 or 5 years of real optimism. And that's when I've set the story. And so there's this contrast between this group of young people who have everything in front of them and who are talented and hopeful. And then these same people many years later, when, life has done stuff to them, and everybody has ended up somewhere different from where they thought they were going to end up. Rob has ended up with Alice. Alice left Jay for Rob.
So yeah, so just to make sure people are clear, Rob and Jay were in art school together.
Yeah, and they're kind of they've got one of those kind of rivalrous male friendships where they're kind of spurring each other on to greater efforts, and it's always kind of teetering on the brink of it's love and hate in the same sort of thing. And they were both painters. They both loved painting, and then Jay became disillusioned with that and then started making a kind of art that's much less material. He wants to make something that's not going to be a toy for collectors or a kind of trophy for collectors. So he starts doing performance. He starts doing this very politically critical kind of performance. Whereas Rob, he just likes to paint. He loves to paint. And so they, as young men, they become, each of the choices they've made kind of becomes implicitly a critique of the choices that the other one have made. And that begins to fracture them apart. Cut to the present day, and Jay is this outsider living in his car, delivering groceries, whose doings in the last decades are a complete mystery. But Rob has kind of stayed true to what he intended to do as a 21-year-old, and he's become a big gallery painter with a big studio full of assistants and a lot of money flowing through his hands, and maybe a few questions about whether in some way he's fallen away from the work that he wanted to make, and instead is making work that sells. And so, Jay popping up into his life is like a kind of, it's the return of the repressed. It's like, the ghost turning up to say, well, what about it? Did you, are you the artist that you thought you were?
And wanted to be at one point. And Jay and Alice were an item in art school, and then Alice leaves Jay for Rob. Basically, at the end of that section that looks back at their past, together in the late 90s.
And of the three of them, Alice is the most intellectual. She's the smartest of the three of them. She wants to be a curator. She has, as a young woman, she has this kind of great art world dream in the same way that the two guys have. But she comes from this sort of wealthy, quite conservative background. She's got a Vietnamese mother and a French father, and there's this kind of notion that she can go off to art school for a bit, but in the way that you kind of get some sort of slightly decorative skill, and then that makes you more marriageable. There's no sense in which her family wants her to work as an artist or a curator or anything like that. So she's looking for an escape, And when she leaves Jay for Rob seems to be providing that kind of escape. And in the present day, their marriage has got a lot of problems, and she's had to put her own ambitions aside in order to essentially to manage his career, because he's kind of unable to do the kind of practical things. And so she has a degree of bitterness about what's happened between them. You know, he disrespects her in various ways. He's serially unfaithful, and she, like all three of these people, life has not turned out the way that they thought it would, and everybody has a lot of unresolved things. So when Jay turns up into the mix, it's a reckoning for all three of them.
And she greets him when he shows up with the groceries for delivery. And one of the things I loved about the book is there's like an element of comedy to it, is the fact that they're both masked. Mm-hmm. And yet there's recognition. Are they? I mean, I'm trying to remember. There's not a face reveal. Is he coughing?
There is no. There's a. Well, yeah. I mean, he takes his mask off, and so she knows it's him. And he's hoping that he's so embarrassed that this is who he is when he's seeing her again, that he's hoping to just kind of slink away without her recognizing him, and then she does, and but he doesn't get to see her without a mask for a period of time. I mean, it's like something that would be in a like a Shakespeare play or something. This kind of comedy of misrecognition. But that was, I mean, the other things. I taught a lot of. I teach creative writing. I teach at NYU on the MFA there, and I had to teach these classes where everybody's masked, and there are people that I had no idea what the bottom half of their faces looked like, and you take a kind of guess at what from their eyes about what's actually going to be down there, and you're completely wrong. It was very weird when I saw these students, and I was like, well, that's actually what you look like. And so I think all that is fascinating. This is a novel which has a kind of comic element to it. Absolutely. I mean, it's a romantic comedy in a certain slightly sort of dark sense, but yeah, all that stuff with masks makes for fascinating, social misrecognition.
Well, and also this period of 20 something years that has elapsed between the last time Alice saw Jay and then in the present day. And so they've aged. So yeah. That's the scene I'm remembering, where she's like taking her mask off and kind of revealing, it's like the face reveal after all these years. And there's something funny about it. There's something kind of like erotic about it.
For sure. I mean,
here I am,
I wasn't really thinking about this when I wrote the book, but on the Indian side of my family, the tradition was that bride and groom wouldn't see each other until the wedding day. And my two aunts, neither of them knew what their husband looked like until they literally lifted a kind of garland of flowers, a veil, in the wedding ceremony. I mean, that's so wild to me, but that's an experience people have had as a kind of erotic experience. So the idea of these two quite worldly people unveiling for each other, and it's just their faces unveiling for each other, it's fascinating to me how that kind of revives a much older sort of social set of rules.
Yeah, I mean, total sidebar, but I think I was talking on this show not too long ago about arranged marriage, and I'm forgetting the context. But the fruit of the conversation for me was that if you have a good family, like a loving family, people really do have your best interest at heart, I could be at least partially persuaded that if there's a group effort to help find you a mate, that it could actually maybe in some cases be better than you at age, 20-something, going out and trying to... Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's how they do it in my family. Several people in my generation have had arranged marriages, and others have had what they call in India a love match. And, the success rate of the arranged marriages is really, really good, because it's done in this. It's not just, the patriarch saying, you're going to marry this woman because of our need for an alliance with their family. In practice, what happens now is that everybody gets a bit of input. People would phone me and say, do you think this kind of girl would be right for your cousin? She seems quite extrovert. She likes this and that. And and so, yeah, I mean, and I was being offered the chance to go down that route as well, which I dodged. But there was a period of my life where I would suddenly be at a wedding and my aunties would surround me, sort of being like, I wonder when the next marriage will be. And they're more or less saying, like, if you leave it to us, we'll get you. She'll just be so hot and she'll be so great and she'll be exactly who you want. And there was part of me that was like, wow, that would be just being issued with a life partner.
Right. Just outsource the legwork, like have somebody else handle it. But there is, I think, wisdom in like group mind versus like the mind of a single individual in some cases, or
yeah, I mean,
in general.
I think in a traditional South Asian family where people really do spend a lot of time with each other and have a very kind of deep knowledge of each other, that group mind is quite accurate. I mean, it doesn't work in other kinds of family structure. And the family structure I grew up with in England is much more kind of like an English family where, everybody's frosty and cold and says, pass the butter every so often. But, that it needs a group of loving people to kind of, with a deep knowledge of the people involved to make it work.
So I want to talk some more about art and art making and the commodification of art, and also this notion of anonymity in art, because you're playing with that with Jay, this disappearance that he undertakes, which is partly due to life circumstances, drugs, lack of money, disillusionment, the breakup with Alice, the betrayal, by his friend from art school who's taken his girl, the whole thing. He sort of just vanishes and checks out. But there are some ideological underpinnings to that choice. And you've alluded to them a bit with regard to Jay's political leanings and maybe like the intellectualization of his work and of artwork writ large versus Rob, who you said just likes to paint. I got to say, like, as a writer and as an artist myself, I did feel like a pang of envy for the Rob, like somebody who just loves to make it, like kind of in an uncomplicated way. I could kind of feel that maybe in you, because I know you're an intellectual, like thinky person. At least that's the way it seems on the page. So wouldn't it be nice to just be like, I love to tell stories. It's just fun.
For sure. I mean, somebody once said to me, and I think this is the line that I've given to Jay in the book, is that, you can divide artists into two types. There are barbarians and intellectuals, and you're one or the other, and you don't get to choose. And I am absolutely the latter. I research, I read philosophy books. I think everything is very thought through, and I'm absolutely jealous of the intuitive, unmediated experience of art making that I see some other people have. And I know from being around friends who operate much more like that they have the similar grass is greener experience about the other kind of artist. But Rob is a barbarian in a straightforward way. He likes the feel of paint. He likes the scratchy sound and the canvas. He I think Jay says about him at one point that he'd be, if he'd lived in another time, he'd have been totally fine with just painting a portrait of the local aristocrat, or a landscape, a mountain at various different times of day. It doesn't matter to him, because what he wants to do is paint. Whereas Jay's relationship to art is this kind of critical relationship, and it is about what it is to make art. What is the meaning of art? Can art have a social function? Can it make political change? All these kind of questions swirl around, and they are much more important to him than making. He's the kind of artist. I mean, they call it, post-medium art, where the actual, the concept is what's important, rather than the kind of tools that you use to execute the concept. Whereas that just wouldn't make sense for somebody like Rob, because he's doing the thing that he wants to do. I have an old. An ex of mine actually is a sculptor, and she makes these figures, and she finds it very difficult to explain why she needs to make these figures, but she's been making them for like 20 years now, and they are a certain way, and they have certain qualities about them, and she makes them, and people like them, so she makes a living. But she's certainly not somebody who you would ever find it was framing her work with a certain sort of like, gallery wall text art speak that other artists speak as a kind of, lingua franca.
There's something I've talked about this at multiple times over the years on this show because it's an enduring fascination to me, which is the art world, the high art world, where the money gets absurd. And, there's, I think, there's a scene in the book where Rob is like, or was it Rob or was it his, the name of that artist?
Mentor, yeah. Well, who's only ever really referred to as a famous dead painter.
FDP. Yeah. But he's like, I could sign my name. You need money? Here, I can sign my name. It's $20,000 or what, you know what I'm saying? Like it gets to a certain point when an artist has reached certain levels in that.
Well, that's literally true. I mean, that's another story that came to me from it's about a friend of a friend, and somebody who's at that level where they were sitting by a pool and we're just saying 20 grand, 20 grand, 20 grand, and there's something obscene about that and absurd about that as well. And it's clearly, in artistic terms, that's, you're not creating value by signing your name on a blank sheet of lithograph paper, but in this kind of strange carousel of the art world, then that's a gesture that has some meaning. And one of the things that fascinates me about the art world in particular, as opposed to other kind of creative milieu, is this way that extreme wealth and extreme poverty butt up against each other and need something from each other. I've been to my share of gallery dinners and watched artists and collectors making nice to each other and listen to the way they talk to each other. And the one thing that you can't talk about is money. Everybody has to pretend that the money is not a meaningful part of the interaction, whether you're the hedge fund billionaire or the artist, young artist living in a squat. But they both want they want things from each other. I mean, it's obvious what the artists want is they want to eat, they want to get paid, they want to be able to make their work. But it took me a while to understand what the particular fascination amongst some of these collectors was in being around a kind of young and grubby and poor smelling group of people. And I realized that there was something about it. It's the art world gives access that's not just purely financial access. Like if you're able to if you're able to make an art collection, the likelihood is that your friend who's richer than you, who has no connection to the art world, could not go into a gallery or a set of galleries and behave like it's a shop and get the same collection. You've built that collection because you have relationships, because you're trusted, your taste is meaningful. It's meaningful for an artist to sell into your collection rather than some other person. So it's a kind of way of differentiating amongst very wealthy people that's not just a purely scores on the doors kind of points-based system. And that there is a fascination amongst very wealthy people in getting a glimpse of how it means to live, to make art rather than to accumulate wealth. They get access to spaces, they get to meet people, they get access to experiences that they wouldn't have otherwise. Again, in the book, there's a squatted artist run space called Fancy Goods. That's it's going to be no surprise to my London friends. It's very closely based on a space that friends of mine used to run in East London called the Bart Wells Institute. And I saw shows at the Bart Wells when friends of mine were sort of living upstairs and making a kind of gallery space downstairs, where unbelievably wealthy people would turn up in taxis to this. It was on a kind of downtrodden East End back street, that semi-ruined kind of place, and just watching these people kind of like pick their way gingerly into the building, and it was like they were kind of entering a fairy tale kingdom. They were entering somewhere which was just so far from their normal world that they couldn't believe it. And you know, you'd see them coming in, and it would be a very exciting moment for some of the artists whose work was on show. And you know, Charles Such, he did go to that space, and he did buy half the show and leave again. And there's this kind of encounter that happens in these art world spaces that I think is so extreme and so fascinating. But the one thing that you can never do is mention money as a motivator, because that's the fiction, is that all the artists are too unworldly to care, and that the collectors are too pure art connoisseurs to care. And you know, so you know, it would be like breaking wind in the room to start talking like this is shopping.
Wow. I mean, that's, I think, the part of it that's so fascinating and so opaque are the social dynamics of it. And you talk about the way that wealthy people differentiate themselves through their collections, and how, you know, if collector A has a great collection, collector B, even if his or her wealth far exceeds collector A, can't replicate it, because you have to know people. It takes time to build the relationships and to get access and to be able to, I mean, it's like, I had a friend who worked as not a friend, I mean, kind of a friend, kids' parents, same school type thing, but was a representative to a lot of artists. And I had like a backyard, like kid birthday party, brief conversation with him, where he was basically like, if you want to lose money quickly, like go out with the idea that like you're going to go out and buy a bunch of valuable art. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, to build a really valuable collection. I suppose if you have unlimited wealth, yeah, you can go buy like a $60 million painting that's probably going to retain its value, but
or stick it in storage in a free port and get it out again in a decade and flip it for a bunch more money. But in terms of like finding young artists, collecting young artists, and working out what's good and what's not in this huge kind of slew of material that's being produced, that is really hard. You know, I mean, the collectors that I've met who I really respect actually they follow their taste. It's not a pure act of speculation in any way, that there's a certain view of the world that they want to express through their collections. I mean, I have a friend who is an extraordinary art collector. He's a guy who used to run a record label in the 80s, and he was part of this sort of downtown New York world in the early 80s. You know, and he backed Jean-Michel Basquiat because he liked this young guy, and so he has like Basquiat's before Basquiat was painting on canvas. You know, he was one of Nan Goldin's early backers. None of those people looked like they were going to make money at that point. He was just into their thing, and he had enough money to be the kind of the sort of lubrication in this little world. And so, you know, years and years later, he's sitting there with this extraordinary work, and you know, and he's wealthy enough to buy also at the kind of top end. I mean, he can go out and point at the multi-million-dollar picture and take it home. But the reason that, you know, he's respected and he's a good collector is that there's a taste driving this, and that there's a cultural and an intellectual agenda driving it. And the best collectors are like that. You know, we shouldn't imagine that every collector is just some sort of rich mark who's being told that the pickled shark is a great idea. But right. there are also those kind of collectors. You know, I have had some fascinating moments at art fairs listening to gallerists sell to, you know, the young finance guy who thinks he should get into art. He's got a bunch of spare money burning a hole in his pocket, and he's never, you know, he's been at the bank all day and all night since he was 20, but so he's never had a moment to develop any kind of cultural taste at all, but wants to buy something. And you know, you see gallerists operate in different ways. There's one kind of gallerist who'll actually try and tease out what you're really about and maybe steer them towards something that will be meaningful. And then there's another kind who'll be like, I've got a big shiny object for you.
Right, right.
And yeah, that'll look great in your loft. Look, it changes color in the light. And,
Right.
and there's yeah, I mean, you watch those transactions happening, and I remember listening to an art advisor talking about how she persuaded Jay-Z to buy a collage by Romer Bearden, very significant post-war black artist, but quite a kind of small object. Apparently, this picture was, and she was concerned that he was in a world where people wanted to kind of put down kind of cash on the barrel for something really big and fancy seeming. And how would she persuade him of the significance of this very high priced thing that she wanted him to buy? But so she staged it I think in the office of the director of the Museum of Modern Art. So he had to kind of walk into the inner sanctum of art, and through all the galleries, and kind of really be reminded of the meaning of this place, and then sees the little picture on its easel and understands that if it's there, it's kind of he's not going to be ripped off. And I think she then went on to help him assemble quite a significant collection. But those things completely fascinate me about it. There's a sort of psychology to being a gallerist, to actually, I think it was Larry Gagosian or someone said it's like being a marriage counselor. Yeah. And, that often there's couples who are collecting, and it's something that they can do together when perhaps they're, he's out making cash, she's sitting on charity boards, and they're living these kind of parallel lives. Whereas here, in being art collectors is something that they can rediscover why they're a couple. All these kind of things are part of that psychology of how value gets created, and about how the meaning of art collecting as a cultural practice gets created. I mean, it's endlessly revealing of human nature, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like you talk about gallerists. Certain gallerists, like Larry Gagosian, is he a gallerist? He's an art trader.
Yeah.
So if he suddenly champions your work, and you're living in the East End of London, and you're some young up and comer living in a squat, it's obviously going to be very good for your career.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it'll certainly be good for your bank balance in the short term. But if maybe Gagosian doesn't do this as much as some, but I mean, Saatchi, for example, is notorious for flipping work. Like, he'd buy everybody, he'd do that thing of turning up to the first show you'd ever had, like buying everything. Suddenly, you've got some cash, you've got this reputation of being a Saatchi artist, and then 3 years later he sells it all again, and then you're damaged goods, and you're kind of done. And so there's people are trying to kind of make relationships with people who won't do that, who won't just see your work as an object of speculation. And Saatchi has done very good things for British art, and so he's not a kind of pure villain in any way, but he also has kind of quite callously divested himself of work that he doesn't want anymore, and that's very bad for the artists who that happens to.
Well, they don't get paid on subsequent resale, do they? I mean, they only
get no, they don't. And and also, if the market is flooded with work that's yours, that's being kind of consigned by collectors, then they could buy the good early work rather than the new weird stuff you're doing, which isn't the same as the stuff everybody liked. Then that kind of thing can happen to people as well.
Well, and it's also, if you have somebody who is known as a thoughtful and skilled collector of art, who has amassed, like Jay-Z, for example, a really cool and valuable art collection, somebody like that takes a shine to your work. That too can be a boon, right? Maybe even more of a boon if it's somebody who's like a real, true art lover who's got a collection and sees value in you.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why artists sell to museums for massively discounted rates. A museum sale is a kind of seal of approval, of a kind of cultural seal of approval that is very important in establishing an artist as somebody whose work actually has meaning rather than just value. And conversely, conversely, there are artists who aren't, who have incredibly high prices but aren't really visible in museums. You're not going to see their work in LACMA or MoMA, but their 7-8 figure sums are changing hands for their painting because there are coteries of collectors for whom those transactions are meaningful. I mean, that's a very lucrative but precarious kind of art career, and some artists, while they're rolling in money, also are kind of deeply unsatisfied because they haven't got a kind of cultural status that they hoped to have.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes this stuff happens posthumously, right? I mean, feel like Basquiat died so young, but just as an example, I guess he was embraced in his lifetime, but I don't think he foresaw.
Well, think of Hilma af Klint would be a good. There she was. She was a circa 1900 Swedish mystic who turns out more or less to have invented abstraction before anyone else, but she directed that no one should even see her paintings. And then many years later, cut to kind of, I don't know, about 10, 15 years ago, suddenly there are some shows of her work and everybody's mind is blown and she's this huge star. And there was she was just not present in art history up until that point, so there are stories like that abound.
Yeah, that's wild. And I want to make sure we talk about other aspects of this novel of yours and the sort of the art world that it depicts, the bubble upstate in New York that it depicts, which I think encapsulates some aspects of the art world. But we have not talked about identity. We've talked a little bit about class, and the way that there are these collisions that the pandemic really brought to bear among class, distinctions. But there's also issues of racial identity happening in this book. Jay is, I believe, he has a white mother and a black
white
father.
Mother and a Jamaican, sort of absent Jamaican dad, but he's grown up in a very white milieu in Essex. It's sort of outside London, but in a conservative and white social world. Alice, as I said, has got a Vietnamese mother who comes from this elite Vietnamese Catholic background, and a rather ne'er-do-well white French father.
Who is extraordinary on the page. Like that scene where they go to visit Alice's father is disturbing and a little bit uproarious. It's a good part of the book.
Yeah, there's a certain sort of circa 1970s French man that I got to depict on the page there. And we haven't talked about, I mean, Marshall, the gallerist, is there too. So there are two couples staying upstate, sheltering from the pandemic. There's Alice and Rob, and then there's Rob's gallerist, Marshall, who's younger. And as we talked about a little bit, is very paranoid, and he's got a much younger black girlfriend called Nicole, who herself wants to be recognized as an artist, but none of the others are paying any attention to her really at all. I mean, and she's becoming increasingly isolated as she realizes that the people that she's with don't connect to her world in any meaningful way at all. She's trying to manage a lot of family difficulties back in New York. She's trying to look after her grandmother and her, she's got a whole kind of set of concerns, very sort of concerns to do with caring for other people and to do with kind of being enmeshed in a social world that the super rich people that she's with have floated free of, and her trajectory through the book is one of increasing disillusionment with her paranoid gun-toting white boyfriend who does not seem to see her in a meaningful way at all. And so she, Jay turns up, this light-skinned black man turns up, and she's like, who are you? What are you doing here? So there's a kind of, she makes a relationship with him, which is very sort of racially inflected in the sense that she's like, well, there's a certain way that you're being with these white people, but what are you, eye to eye. How will you be with me? So there's that dynamic going on as well. And
And
so
we should mention too that like the backdrop of the novel, as we've talked about, is COVID, but also the George Floyd murder in the spring/summer of 2020.
yeah, so the period of the present day of the book is exactly this moment. So it's been a few days before the video of the murder starts to circulate online until a week or two after that, and this is something that is deeply important to Nicole. That, I mean, she can't this is it's she sort of bears the full weight of this video and the kind of meaning that it has. And another thing that alienates her from the other people is that they don't seem to have a relationship to it at all. It's just a thing they saw on the internet. And and that's a kind of moment of absolute break for her with Marshall and the others.
Yeah, Marshall. I mean, Marshall's a comic character. It's interesting too the way that you blended certain like personality traits. Like as we've discussed, he's paranoid. He's got his guns. He's on the internet too much. And his response to the pandemic is like a bit more paranoid than the average person. He's also, like, when we talk about this world of collecting, a deep enthusiast when it comes to the art world and very knowledgeable. Like he's really tuned in, and he strikes me as somebody who might be able to amass a good collection if he had the resources.
Yeah, I mean, he's a young dealer who's kind of making a name for himself by a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of art. I mean, for me, the kind of intensity of research that he brings to finding out about art is also his downfall in terms of, the same intensity of research. Like he brings to looking at conspiracy sites about the pandemic. And so he's hyperactive. He's got too much energy. He's cooped up in this place. He's a gregarious creature. I think to be good at that job, you have to be a deeply social character and to kind of enjoy swimming in the social pool of New York, LA, in a city like that. And then, boom, to be kind of, thrown upstate with 3 other people for company is just disastrous. There's not enough stimulation
for a person like him. And we should, we haven't even talked about the people who own this compound, who are very wealthy art collectors, to whom Marshall feels a sense of reverence, obligation.
There's a sort of tech titan character who's off stage, who's the owner of this. I mean, it's a huge place. I mean, we should say that the place that they're in is unusually large. It's a sort of massive acreage of mostly woodland, but with quite a modest house in the middle of it. So it's a kind of, I suppose there's a sort of Marie Antoinette-ish quality to it, like a little hermitage that's actually like the expression of vast wealth. But the owner's off in his bunker in New Zealand, but he's techie enough and he's paranoid enough to have a very sort of high-tech visual surveillance system all over this property, including, out in the woods. So there's this strange quality that you could be out on your own, but also you could be being watched by the eye in the sky kind of equivalent, or the eye in the trees. And so that, and Marshall is, he's one of Marshall's collector base, and he's the person who's lent Marshall the place. And so Marshall feels like he's kind of he's the manager, and that he should be controlling who comes in and who doesn't. And it's very, very challenging for him to have a new person from outside the group arrive, and especially somebody who's visibly been sick and he suspects might still be sick, might be about to bring the disease into the sort of sacred space of the pod. So I like the idea that in this book that there's a sort of level of there's an elite level that we don't even get to see. They're so they're so powerful that we don't even get to.
That's the thing. I mean, like the presence of this. Is it Glenn and Miranda? I'm totally forgiven.
Greg, I think. Yeah,
Greg. Sorry. So Greg and Miranda are, the tech titan and his much younger partner are sort of off stage and looming as a threat. That's the sense of them for me as a reader. Like, are they going to show up? What's going to happen? And there's also the weird, like, big money has a gravitational force on people. Like, fame does the same thing. If you're in a room and suddenly Jeff Bezos walks in or Jay-Z walks into the room, like, everybody is kind of forced to respond. I've noticed this living in Los Angeles, and even in myself in ways that I don't like. I'm like, I don't want to be responding to this. It's discomfort.
Yeah, I don't want to be aware that they're standing over there. Like, I want to, I feel less good about myself, and that I'm not immune to the gravitational force. I think that's absolutely true. You see people respond involuntarily, but that's these two currencies that are often related, money and fame, that do have this kind of pull. Like, people aren't kind of sure what they could get out of it, but they might as well be nice. Better to be nice than not to be nice. And or people are performatively not nice. That's kind of, people have these extraordinary reactions. I remember sort of spending a few days kind of in the entourage of a 90s rock star. This is kind of back when I was in my 20s, and I had kind of stumbled accidentally into this situation, and kind of just seeing how people were behaving with this guy, like losing their minds, but also kind of sometimes being very violent and oppositional, like they couldn't be neutral, like, and if they kind of struggled against their attraction or their against this gravity, they often did it in like really strange and kind of over the top ways. I realized that for all the fun, it was also quite scary to be that person, to be someone who this could happen to. He described to me like walking through London and somebody's coming up and punching him in the face just out of nowhere. That was the kind of level of intensity that surrounded him at that time.
Who was it? May I ask, or is it?
It's Damon Albarn from Blur. At a point when that band was like the biggest Britpop band, it's the same period of time as the early part of the book is set in. But he was the subject of a real kind of cult. It was like the sort of the Beatles thing of the girls chasing down the street. So it was kind of wild to have a brief ringside seat, and what it meant to be 27 and everybody in the club wanting to try and sleep with you.
Yeah, it's actually not. It's not all fun and games, right? It's not that. The issue, there's for everybody who wants to sleep with you, there's an angry boyfriend who now wants to kind of hurt you because they've been humiliated by their girlfriend. But also, like, sometimes, like you say, people react violently in a kind of crazy, reflexive way. Like, it brings out weird responses that are sometimes like incommensurate with the moment. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine it must be very disorienting to be at the center of something like that and to have to navigate all of these responses.
I think some of the behaviors that we associate with weird famous people, like the kind of, and we think, well, that's not very nice of you to be like that. It's actually, there's sort of elements of self-defense in some of it, and being very standoffish, not being accessible, being apparently angry for reasons that you can't understand. Even the kind of, I wanted my chai latte, frothed growing up. That sort of stuff is sometimes has kind of, there are reasons for that stuff that isn't always visible. I'm not saying that there's not just bad behavior, because people will put up with a lot of bad behavior from rich and famous people, but sometimes I think there's a kind of madness that you're surrounded by that is very scary and may lead you to being quite weird yourself.
Well, speaking of doing something weird, I don't want to part company with you without talking at least a little bit about Fugue, which is, I suppose we call it a performance art piece. Like, this disappearance that Jay undertakes lasts 20 years and is in its way a kind of performance art.
Yeah, I mean, I got very interested in artists who leave the art world and various kinds of gestures of refusal. I mean, there are various artists who have found ways to do this, to be absent, but in some way still to be making art, or their absence being art. I think, I mean, actually quite a lot of LA people. I mean, I think of Chris Burden, who, 60s artist, who's kind of most famous for crucifying himself on the hood of a VW Beetle, but also did various performances where he kind of disappeared, or was invisible or absent in some way. Bastian Ader, another guy who taught at CalArts, Dutch guy who taught at CalArts in the 70s, he did disappear, and as part of a performance where he tried to sail across the Atlantic in a tiny, tiny one-man sailing boat, far too small for that kind of trip, and he was never seen again. He set off from New York and was never seen again, and presumably died somewhere in the middle Atlantic, and nothing was ever found. And there are artists who declared that they were leaving the art world and never made art again. There's a Chinese American performance artist called Te-Xing Xue, who became famous in the 70s for these incredibly intense, like year-long performances. Like for a year, he wouldn't go inside, and for another year he was roped to another person, and for another year he clocked on like a kind of time, like punching a clock every morning, and then at a certain point he made a declaration that he was no longer an artist, and then has never made any art anymore. I've recently found out he'd been running a dumpling restaurant quite near me in Brooklyn, and was very annoyed to find that I hadn't been in to I could have eaten Te-Xing's dumplings. But so all these kind of people who vanish or refuse, or refuse the terms and conditions of the art world, I think it's a very interesting response to certain things about money and about circulation and about rich collectors and all the stuff we've been talking about. And Jay is one of these people, and so he takes his leave, I suppose would be one way of putting it. And it's an open-ended thing, and the kind of question in the book, which the book eventually resolves, but I guess it would be a spoiler to talk about too much, is like when he ceased to be making art, when did this performance end? Has he, is he still an artist even though he's a guy delivering groceries out of his car, or was that just part of his past?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's interesting too that there's some tradition that he's working in. I mean, it's not just like this anomalous thing that's happening in your fiction. Like you say, there are many artists.
I mean, just saying no in that kind of Bartleby-ish way is a kind of interesting thing to do, and not being present, not being at the gallery opening, not being kind of pitching your work, not being kind of a face on the scene is an interesting choice and can have meaning. I mean, the epigram in the novel is by an artist called Lee Lozano, and she was somebody who made a series of increasingly confrontational kind of conceptual art gestures in the late 60s, culminating in her saying that she wasn't going to speak to any men for a year. And then after that, she made an announcement that she was leaving the art world, and did. And I mean, and she's somebody who seems to have spiraled down into a kind of into quite a kind of bad mental state. But the question with these people who have an afterlife, I mean, you think famously in writing of Rimbaud, he stops writing poetry at 21. Like, what does he do for the rest of his life? There's another kind of 20 something years until he dies as a gun trader in East Africa in his 40s. But is he still the Rimbaud who made that poetry, even though he's not writing any more poetry? Like, what's going on in the mind of the person who could do such amazing stuff but is choosing not to anymore? And I think that's endlessly fascinating, because it's a kind of black box situation. You're kind of, people fantasize about these people, about what must be going on when they're so silent and they're so absent.
Well, and that arc to go from being a visionary poet in late adolescence to a gun trader. That's not
Yeah.
that's unique.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, Sid Barrett would be someone else. Sid Barrett from the first lineup of Pink Floyd, who became the kind of paradigmatic acid casualty and was sort of in later life was this sort of shambling, overweight figure carrying plastic bags around, living with his mum in Cambridge, and the sort of loss of somebody who is a creative talent whose light, his light shines very brightly, is also inevitably it's fascinating to people.
Yeah. Well, there's so much going on in this novel, and it's just a true pleasure to read. It's very richly imagined. It's got, like I say, a lot of things on its mind for people who make art, want to make art, admire people who do. Like, this is a great novel for those kinds of readers because it gives you an opportunity to kind of look under the hood and to think about these things in the hands of a writer who knows what he's doing and has been in, like you say, you've been in these galleries and you know a thing or two about this world. And it was just a pleasure. So I appreciate the time. I always end by asking if my guest is working on anything new. I'm imagining that this cycle of books, the red, white, and blue cycle, is done, or is green coming? Like
I just go through the whole spectrum. No, I'm trying to move on to something different. I am into something new, not super talkable about yet, but it's I'm very interested in the ways that people are trying to kind of manifest reality, the kind of story that's around in our culture right now, that you can think and grow rich, or that you can kind of make the reality that you want to by the force of your will. And there's something I'm very interested in the way that our reality seems quite thin these days, and I'm trying to write a story around that.
All right. Well, we will look forward to it. Harry, thank you so much for the time, and congratulations on Blue Ruin.
Thank you so much, Brad. And as ever, really appreciate you and appreciate what you do with the show.